is going to show a profit on sale of asset of 5 million, being the 10 million proceeds minus the 5 million revaluation reserve, right? But for CGT purposes, my proceeds would be 10 million and my base cost would be 1 million. So I've actually got a capital gain of 9, but I've only got 5 million available for distribution. And that then is an example of where I would have 5 million, which I could pass on to the beneficiaries, but 4 million would have to be taxed in the trust. And in the same way, that, yeah, for clarification, when I say it has to be taxed in the trust, the implication there is that it doesn't show up as being taxed in the hands of the beneficiary. It just basically would show as a standard capital gain in the tax return of the trust, because that's the portion that is taxable by you, right? Which would be similar to if you've distributed a capital gain to a non-resident beneficiary, your disclosure in your tax return would just be a straight capital gain made by trust, taxable in trust, right? In your financials, you would probably have a blurb showing, doing some form of statement along the lines of capital gain of 10 million awarded to beneficiary, non-resident beneficiary, portion of tax attributable to it, amount paid to beneficiary. That's how most people then would handle it in their financials. Okay. So, share options. Now, obviously, share options is quite an intense conversation and it can get incredibly technical, and there's lots of different permutations and thought processes with it. All right. I think if I can, the simplest way I can explain the restricted equity instrument conditions is to actually go back to the actual definition as it is in the Act. Right. And what I want you to do for a moment is just to actually take a moment and read through the definition. I know it's a lot of legalese and verbiage, but just to take a minute and read through the definition, because this is also the problem with shortcuts. I'll, I'll save you some reading time. C, D, E, and F are essentially repeats of points A and B, just in varying different permutations of people trying to get clever with the definition and to not have it apply, but still have the restriction. Do you notice there's a common thread? The common thread in all of these is not that you can't have a restriction on the disposal. It's that the restriction cannot result in a disposal at something other than market value. So if we look at the first one, a restriction on disposal, telling me I have to sell it back to the company, that's an offer of first refusal and is standard for Pty Limiteds under the Companies Act. That in and of itself is not the problem. The problem is if the clause then goes on to say, I must sell it back to the company for a price that is not market value. That's where I'm going to kick in to have a restricted equity instrument. It's the same thing as if I have to forfeit ownership when I leave employment, for example. or if there is a behavior clause or morality clause in my contract, for example, and you have a dispute price and a market price. Now, in that case, it could be a restricted equity instrument because you are being prevented from selling the shares at fair market value on the day you are disposing of those shares. So inherently, something like, if we go back to the first example here, is that escrow account by itself is not enough to make it a restricted equity instrument. There would need to be features in addition to just simply an escrow account in order for it to be a restricted equity instrument. Okay, point one, while it's in the escrow account, who does the growth belong to? Is it mine or is it the company's? If it hasn't vested in me yet, then it's also not a restricted equity instrument because a restricted equity instrument is one that's vested in me. If the only reason it's in the escrow account is because they are attempting to hold it as surety for the payment, as long as it will be sold at market value if I don't make the payment, then if we go back to this, I am not being prevented from disposing of my shares at market value. So an escrow account is effectively think of it like a surety account. It's essentially it's an attorney's trust account, but not held by attorneys. So it's where I put the money to one side, saying those are not mine. I'm holding them in a surety capacity until the final payment has been made, and then they're released and moved off to and become yours. All right, it's a legal term. So for us in our standard the rule of thumb, and generally I don't like shortcuts, but I think for share options, especially in the P2I limited space, it works. As long as the condition you're imposing doesn't mean that you are prevented from selling at market value, you probably are going to scope out of restricted equity instruments. Okay. So it's not quite as broad as you probably think, right? However, tied in with that part G, that is, if it is not deliverable to the taxpayer until the happening of an event, whether fixed or contingent, right, that would be a restricted equity instrument. But if it's not mine and it doesn't actually belong to me, the next question is then, has it actually vested in me? Which then brings me to the question, remember, you only actually have to recognize your 8C on vesting. There are some very strange quirks where it's possible that the shares could have vested in me, but they're still not deliverable to me. But those are generally quite few and far between. Okay. But to look carefully at those.